My name is Emily Carter, and on the day I should have felt the pure joy of celebrating my baby girl's first month of life, I instead stood in a room full of decorations and silence, staring at a row of empty chairs I had reserved for my family. The pastel balloons still floated against the ceiling, the pink and white cake sat untouched, the little floral dress I had chosen for Lily looked almost too perfect for a party without guests. I kept glancing at the door, telling myself maybe they were just late, maybe my parents, my cousins, my closest sister Sarah would walk in smiling and apologizing for the delay. But as each minute passed, the truth became clearer. Nobody was coming. Not my parents, not my cousins, not even Sarah, the one I had always believed would be by my side no matter what. Each absence felt like a fresh blow. This was not just about missing a party. It was about them rejecting one of the most important days in my life and my daughter's first milestone. Guests from Daniel's side of the family tried to be polite, filling the air with light conversation, but I could feel the pity in their eyes. Every time someone asked where my family was, I forced a smile and said they must have been caught up with something important. Inside, I was screaming. The photographer I had hired approached me to ask if I wanted to take a family photo with Lily and Daniel. I glanced at the chairs again and shook my head. My throat felt tight. My eyes burned, but I would not cry, not here, not yet. When the last guest left and the house fell quiet, Daniel squeezed my hand and told me not to let them ruin this day, but I could not shake the hollow ache in my chest. I dialed my mother's number, expecting at least a flimsy excuse, but her voice was cold and dismissive. "We told you we had other plans, Emily. Stop making everything about you." Before I could respond, my father's voice cut in from the background, calling me a selfish brat who needed to be taught a lesson. I thought it was just another cruel comment until half an hour later they pulled into our driveway uninvited. My pulse quickened as I stepped outside, thinking we might finally talk face to face. Instead, my father's eyes were hard and my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Without warning, he told me to step into the yard because he had something to show me. I followed confused until I saw it, a large metal dog cage sitting by the fence, its door hanging open. My stomach dropped before I could even form a question. He grabbed my arm and shoved me inside, snapping the lock shut. "Maybe now you will learn your place," he said as Sarah's laughter rang in my ears and the cold metal pressed against my back. At that moment, humiliation and fury collided inside me, and something in me broke. But I also knew in that instant they would never hold power over me again. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone else's business and reputations stuck to you like glue. My parents, John and Margaret Carter, had lived in the same three-bedroom house for over 30 years, and in that time, they had cultivated an image of being respectable pillars of the community. My father was known for his stern handshake and his loud opinions at town meetings, while my mother was admired for her meticulous garden and the charity bake sales she organized for the local church. Behind closed doors, however, the Carter family operated under a strict, unspoken hierarchy. My father's word was final on all matters. My mother reinforced his authority with quiet compliance, and my older sister Sarah enjoyed the privileges of being the golden child. I, on the other hand, was labeled the difficult one, the stubborn one, the one who always asked too many questions. As children, Sarah and I were close enough to share secrets and giggle under the covers during thunderstorms, but by the time she reached high school, she had learned that siding with my parents earned her more freedom and praise. She began to echo my father's criticisms of me adopting his tone of condescension, as if she had the right to judge me. By the time I was old enough to leave for college, our relationship had become polite but distant. I met my husband Daniel when I was 23, working as a junior designer for a small interior design firm in Columbus. He was an engineer with a quiet sense of humor and a steady presence that I found grounding after years of family drama. We dated for 2 years before marrying in a modest ceremony that my parents attended out of obligation rather than joy. They made no secret of their disapproval of Daniel, whom they considered too reserved, too unwilling to curry favor with them. Still, I had hoped that over time they would warm to him. We eventually moved back closer to my hometown, partly because Daniel found a good job with a manufacturing company there, and partly because I still clung to the belief that physical proximity might repair old wounds. We rented a modest two-story house with a small yard on a quiet street 15 minutes from my parents' place. I told myself that having them nearby would mean they could be more involved when we eventually started a family. When I became pregnant with Lily, it felt like a turning point. My mother expressed mild excitement over the phone, though it was undercut by practical questions about whether we could afford a child and if I planned to keep working. Sarah sent a congratulatory text with a string of emojis and a note about being too busy at work to visit anytime soon. Still, I chose to focus on the positive, imagining that once Lily arrived, they would all want to be part of her life. Daniel was cautiously optimistic, but he had seen enough of their behavior to remain skeptical. He reminded me more than once not to expect grand gestures or sudden changes in personality. I brushed it off, telling him that a baby often brings families together. In those months, I threw myself into preparing for Lily's arrival, painting her nursery a soft lavender, sewing curtains by hand, and assembling a crib with Daniel on a Saturday afternoon while rain pattered against the windows. The day she was born, my heart swelled in a way I could not have predicted. Holding her tiny body and looking into her barely opened eyes, I thought this would be the moment that would finally melt the frost in my parents' hearts. But when I called to share the news, my father simply said, "Congratulations," in a flat voice, and my mother launched into a list of tips about feeding schedules as if she were reading from a pamphlet. They did not come to the hospital. They did not send flowers. Sarah claimed she had a work deadline and promised to visit soon, but weeks passed without any sign of her. Daniel's family, by contrast, showered us with attention, bringing meals, visiting regularly, and offering to babysit so I could rest. Each kind gesture from them highlighted the absence of my own blood relatives. By the time Lily's 1-month celebration approached, I had convinced myself that this was the opportunity to reset everything to create a warm family moment that would be remembered for years. I believed with almost childlike hope that this time they would show up. When Daniel and I decided to host Lily's 1-month celebration, we wanted it to be something special, a gathering that would not only honor our daughter's first milestone, but also bring our families together in a way that might start healing the old rifts. I imagined the living room filled with laughter, the dining table covered in food, the baby being passed lovingly from one relative to another. It was not just about Lily, it was about proving to myself that my family could show up when it mattered. I began planning a month in advance, choosing a Saturday afternoon so no one could use work as an excuse. I picked a soft pink and cream color scheme, ordered a custom cake with Lily's name in delicate script, and hired a local photographer who specialized in family events to capture candid moments. I created invitations with a photo of Lily sleeping peacefully in her lavender nursery and mailed them to my parents Sarah and a few cousins, even though most of them lived nearby. For my parents and Sarah, I also called personally to tell them the date and time, making sure they marked their calendars. My mother's response was non-committal, but she did not refuse. Sarah sounded distracted, but said she would try to make it. That tiny word, try, nagged at me, but I pushed the worry aside. I wanted to believe that blood and the arrival of a new family member would be enough to draw them in. I budgeted carefully, cutting back on other expenses so we could afford a catered lunch from a local Italian restaurant that everyone loved. Daniel supported the idea, but warned me gently not to put too much emotional weight on their attendance. His exact words were, "Emily, you know how they are if they come. It will be a nice surprise if they do not. We will still have a beautiful day." I nodded, but inside I was certain they would not miss this. In the weeks leading up to the party, I texted my mother updates about Lily's sleeping patterns and the funny little noises she made when she stretched, hoping to spark some connection. I sent Sarah pictures of Lily in her tiny outfits, adding captions about how much her aunt would love to see her. Their replies were brief and sometimes delayed, but I told myself they were just busy. Daniel's side of the family was enthusiastic from the start, offering to bring desserts and decorations, and making sure we had everything we needed. Their energy kept my spirits high. A week before the party, I called my parents again to confirm. My mother said she and Dad would see what they could do depending on other commitments. I felt a flicker of unease, but I reminded myself that people sometimes play coy to make a bigger entrance later. Sarah did not pick up my call, but texted the next day saying she had been swamped with work. I chose to take her at her word. I spent the final days cleaning the house, arranging fresh flowers, and even renting a small white canopy for the backyard in case the weather was nice enough to mingle outside. I ironed a floral dress for Lily and laid out my own soft blue wrap dress, the one Daniel had always said brought out my eyes. I booked a hair appointment for the morning of the celebration so I could feel confident in the photos. In my mind, the day was shaping up to be perfect, a chance for my parents to hold their granddaughter for the first time, and for Sarah to show that she cared despite the distance that had grown between us. Looking back, I realize how much of myself I had tied to the idea of them showing up, how desperately I wanted their approval and acknowledgement. It was not just a party, it was a test of whether I still mattered to them and whether they could finally see me as more than the rebellious daughter they had spent years criticizing. That hope blinded me to the signs that they were never planning to come. 2 weeks before the celebration, the first crack appeared in the picture I had built in my head. Sarah called me late on a Tuesday evening, her voice casual, almost too casual, as she mentioned she might have to skip the party because of something going on that weekend. She did not elaborate, instead, steering the conversation to a new pair of shoes she had bought. I asked what could be more important than meeting her niece for the first time, and she hesitated before saying she would try to explain later. That night, as I scrolled through social media, I saw a post from one of our cousins. It was a group photo of Sarah and my parents at a travel agency holding brochures for a beach resort. The caption read, "Counting down to family weekend getaway." My chest tightened. I stared at the picture, trying to make sense of it. The trip was scheduled for the exact weekend of Lily's party. I called my mother immediately. When she picked up, her tone was already defensive. "We already have plans, Emily," she said, as if it were a minor scheduling hiccup. "It is just a baby party. She will not even remember it." I reminded her that this was the first time she would see her granddaughter and that I had told them the date weeks ago. She sighed and said, "Well, we need a break, and your father has been looking forward to this trip. Maybe we can stop by another time." I could feel the heat rising in my face. I told her plainly that this was hurtful and disrespectful. She brushed it off, telling me not to be so dramatic. When I reached out to Sarah, she claimed she had not realized the dates clashed and said she could not cancel because the trip was already paid for. She tried to soften it by suggesting we FaceTime during the party, but the offer felt hollow. I hung up, feeling the first wave of betrayal crash over me. For the next few days, I tried to focus on the preparations, but the knowledge that they had chosen a beach trip over meeting Lily gnawed at me. Daniel noticed my distracted mood and urged me to let it go, but I could not. It was not just about this one event. It was about every school play they skipped, every birthday they forgot, every time Sarah's wants came before my needs. This was just the latest entry in a long list of moments where I was reminded of my place in the family hierarchy. A week before the party, I made one last attempt, calling my parents to tell them how much it would mean to me. My father answered this time, his voice gruff. "Emily, we are not going to argue about this. We deserve some time away. You can have your little gathering without us." I swallowed hard, fighting back tears, and ended the call. In that moment, I began to accept that they were not coming. Still, a small part of me clung to the hope that they might surprise me, walk in at the last minute, and prove me wrong. But deep down, I knew better. That lingering hope would make what came next cut even deeper. The morning of Lily's 1-month celebration dawned bright and clear, with a hint of early spring warmth in the air, and for a fleeting moment I allowed myself to believe it would be a perfect day. Daniel and I were up early arranging tables in the living room and out under the canopy in the backyard. I dressed Lily in her tiny floral dress with a matching headband, and her soft newborn scent filled the room as I fastened the buttons. She looked like something out of a magazine ad, all round cheeks and sleepy eyes. The catered food arrived just before noon, filling the house with the comforting aroma of baked ziti garlic bread and roasted vegetables. The cake sat on the dining table, its pink frosting glistening under the sunlight streaming through the window. Guests from Daniel's family began to arrive, carrying wrapped gifts and desserts, their voices mingling in cheerful greetings. I kept glancing at the clock each time the doorbell rang, expecting to see my parents or Sarah, but each time it was another cousin from Daniel's side, or a neighbor from down the street. The 6 chairs I had set aside for my family remained conspicuously empty, their cream-colored covers smooth and untouched, as if waiting for someone who would never come. The photographer began snapping candid shots of guests, mingling Lily being passed gently between Daniel's mother and sisters and the buffet table laden with food. At one point, she asked if I wanted to gather my family for a photo. I looked at the empty chairs and felt my stomach knot. "Not right now," I murmured, forcing a smile that did not reach my eyes. I moved through the room, greeting people, thanking them for coming, accepting compliments about Lily. But underneath the polite exchanges, a hollow ache grew stronger with each passing minute. Daniel stayed close, sensing my unease and quietly refilling my water glass or squeezing my hand when he caught my gaze. An hour into the party, it became painfully obvious that my family was not just late. They were not coming at all. The hope I had been clinging to evaporated, leaving behind a mixture of embarrassment and anger. I imagined my parents lounging at the beach, Sarah posting photos of cocktails by the pool, while I stood here surrounded by people who were kind, but not the ones I had longed to see. When the last guest left and the house was quiet again, the contrast between the bright decorations and the emptiness in my chest was almost unbearable. The cake had barely been touched, the chairs were still in perfect alignment, and the gifts sat stacked neatly in the corner waiting to be opened. Daniel wrapped his arm around me and told me not to let them take this day from me, but I could not shake the feeling that they already had. I went to the kitchen to start cleaning up the remnants of the party. My movements mechanical, the earlier joy completely drained away. In that quiet moment, I realized the day I had built up in my mind as a bridge toward reconciliation had instead become proof of just how little my presence, or my child's presence, mattered to them. After the last of Daniel's family had gone and the house was still, I stood in the living room staring at the empty chairs as if expecting them to suddenly fill. The silence pressed in around me until I could not bear it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called my mother, determined to demand an explanation. She answered on the second ring, her voice flat as if she had been expecting this call. "We told you we had other plans, Emily. Stop making everything about you." The casual cruelty in her tone hit me like a slap. I reminded her that this was her granddaughter's first celebration, that she had chosen a trip over, meeting her for the first time. Before she could reply, my father's voice cut in from the background, sharp and full of disdain. "Tell her to stop whining. She is a selfish brat who needs to learn her place." My stomach turned. This was not new. I had heard those words in one form or another my entire life. But today they landed differently, heavier, more final. I told them they were being disrespectful and that I was done excusing it. My father laughed without humor and said, "Maybe we should come over and give you a lesson in respect." I thought he was bluffing until half an hour later I saw their car pulling into the driveway. My pulse quickened. Daniel looked at me concerned, but I told him to stay inside with Lily while I handled it. I stepped out onto the porch and saw my father climbing out of the driver's seat, his posture rigid, his face set in a scowl. My mother followed, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Sarah was in the back seat scrolling her phone, but she got out when she saw me. Without any greeting, my father said, "Come out to the yard. I have something to show you." Confused, I followed them around the side of the house. The air was cool, and the faint scent of the catering still lingered from the open trash bags. That was when I saw it. A large metal dog cage, the kind you would use for a German shepherd, sitting by the fence. The door hung open and the inside was empty except for a worn blanket. My father stood beside it, his expression unreadable. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tight. Without warning, he stepped forward, grabbed my arm, and shoved me toward the cage. "Maybe now you will learn your place," he said as he pushed me inside and slammed the door shut. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in my ears. I stumbled backward, hitting the cold metal bars. Sarah's laughter burst out sharp and mocking as she lifted her phone to record. My mother stood a few feet away, silent, her eyes darting anywhere but at me. I could feel the rough texture of the blanket under my hands, the chill from the ground seeping through the thin fabric of my dress. My father leaned down just enough to meet my eyes. "You think you are better than us with your little party and your perfect life. You need to remember where you came from." My heart pounded in my chest, part fear, part rage. I heard the front door open and Daniel's voice calling my name. He appeared seconds later, his face blanching when he saw me locked inside. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, striding toward my father. "Stay out of family business," my father barked, but Daniel ignored him, pulling a small set of bolt cutters from the shed. In one swift motion, he snapped the lock and swung the door open. I stepped out, my legs shaking, my palms damp with sweat. I wanted to scream, I wanted to cry, but instead I stood tall and looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces in that moment. They thought they had humiliated me. They had no idea they had just given me all the proof I would ever need. The moment I stepped out of that cage, the air felt different, sharper, colder, as if the world itself had shifted. My father stood with his arms crossed, a faint smirk on his face, as though locking me in there was nothing more than a harmless joke. Sarah kept her phone pointed at me, her eyes glittering with cruel amusement, while my mother lingered near the porch, pretending to examine the flower beds. Daniel's grip tightened around the bolt cutters still in his hand, his knuckles white. I could feel the adrenaline pounding in my veins, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I told my father he had crossed a line, that this was not discipline or some twisted family lesson. It was abuse, pure and simple. He chuckled low under his breath and said, "You call it abuse, I call it teaching respect." Sarah snorted and muttered that I was overreacting as usual. I turned to my mother, asking if she was really going to stand there and let this happen. She shifted uncomfortably and said, "Your father is just trying to get through to you, Emily. You make everything so dramatic." That was the final straw. Years of being dismissed, ignored, and belittled boiled up all at once. I told them in a steady voice that they would never be welcome near me or my child again. My father's smirk faltered, but only for a second before he stepped closer, towering over me. "You think you can cut us out?" he said. "You think you are better than us because you married some quiet little man and threw a party with fancy food? You are still my daughter, and I can put you in your place anytime I want." Daniel moved between us, his voice firm, telling my father to leave before he called the police. My father laughed and said, "Go ahead, call them, they will side with me." That was when I saw Sarah's phone still recording, and a spark of realization hit me. She was not filming to protect me, she was filming to humiliate me later. I walked up to her, slowly meeting her gaze until she lowered the phone for just a second, and I said, "Send me that video, Sarah." She looked surprised, but then smirked, thinking she was giving me a keepsake of my shame. "Fine," she said, tapping her screen and sending it to me. I checked my phone and confirmed it had arrived, crystal clear footage of my father shoving me into the cage, my mother looking away, and Sarah laughing. I slipped the phone into my pocket, my mind already moving faster than my pounding heart. This was not going to end with me crying in my living room or pretending nothing happened. They had just handed me the weapon I needed to show everyone exactly who they really were. Without another word, I turned my back on them and went inside, with Daniel following closely behind. Through the window, I saw my father gesturing angrily to my mother and Sarah as they stalked back to their car. The sound of the engine starting was like a door slamming shut on any remaining illusions I had about my family. What they had done today was meant to break me, but all it had done was solidify my resolve. They wanted to control me, humiliate me, make me feel small. Instead, they had given me the perfect evidence to destroy the facade they had spent decades building. When the front door closed behind us, the noise of their car fading into the distance, I felt the quiet settle heavy in the air, but beneath it there was something new pulsing through me like an electric current. Daniel set the bolt cutters on the kitchen counter and asked softly if I was okay. I nodded, even though my body was still trembling, because for the first time in years, I could see my way forward with absolute clarity. I pulled out my phone, opened the video Sarah had sent, and watched it from start to finish. The image was steady, the audio clear. My father's hand on my arm, forcing me into the cage. My mother, looking away. Sarah's laugh echoing sharp and cruel. Daniel bursting in to cut the lock. Every detail was there, undeniable. I played it again, letting the anger rise, not to consume me, but to sharpen me. I told Daniel I was going to use it. He asked if I meant for the police, and I said not only the police, I wanted the whole town to see exactly what my family was capable of. He hesitated, reminding me that once it was out there, it could not be taken back, that it would scorch every bridge between us. I told him that bridge had been burned the second they locked me in that cage. This was not about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about taking away their power, the image they had so carefully curated in the community. For decades, they had been the respectable Carters, the ones people turned to for advice, the ones who hosted charity events and sat in front pews on Sunday mornings. Nobody knew what happened behind closed doors. I was done protecting them. Daniel's eyes searched mine, and then he nodded, saying, "If this is what you need to do, I am with you." I spent the next hour drafting a post on Facebook, my hands steady on the keyboard. I began with a photo from the party. 6 empty chairs lined up in a row, captioned with the truth that not a single member of my family had come to my daughter's first celebration. Then I attached the video. No edits, no music, just raw footage, and I wrote, "Every smiling face you see in church, every handshake you receive at the town meeting, this is what they are capable of when the doors are closed." I tagged my parents Sarah and several extended relatives. Before posting, I read it over twice, making sure every word was measured, not hysterical, not petty, just factual. When I hit publish, there was no hesitation. Daniel stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, as the little spinning wheel turned, and then it was live. Within minutes, the notifications started. Friends from high school, former neighbors, people I barely spoke to anymore, were reacting, commenting, sharing. My phone buzzed nonstop as the views climbed into the hundreds, then thousands. Each comment felt like another stone in the wall I was building between myself and their control. Shock, disbelief, outrage, people who had once defended my parents were demanding answers. I sat back in my chair watching it spread and felt something I had not felt in years: freedom. They had wanted to cage me literally and metaphorically, but now their actions were the ones trapped in that frame forever. Once the initial surge of reactions poured in, I knew the video alone would not be enough to truly dismantle the image my parents had built over decades. I wanted to make sure that every person who had ever looked up to them saw not only what they did to me, but also the pattern of behavior that had defined my entire life. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of messages from people who could not believe what they had seen, asking if it was real. I replied to each one with the same short answer: "Yes, it happened last night, and it is only one example of years of abuse." Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table, watching as I began pulling out old photos and documents from a box I had kept in the closet. Report cards from school, plays I had starred in where they never showed up. Letters I had written to them as a teenager, begging for support that went unanswered. A picture from my high school graduation where the seat beside me was empty because they had decided to go on vacation instead. I scanned each item and added it to a folder on my laptop. I then created a long post weaving the video into a timeline of neglect and favoritism towards Sarah. It started with a story from when I was 8 years old and they skipped my spelling bee to help Sarah practice for a soccer game. It moved through the years, hitting every major moment they had dismissed or sabotaged. Each point was backed up with a photo or a screenshot. I wanted to make it impossible for anyone to write this off as a one-time lapse in judgment. Daniel suggested that I include some of the things they had said to me over the years, the casual cruelty that might seem small on its own, but added up to a lifetime of emotional damage. I hesitated, but then agreed, because people needed to understand the full scope. I included the phrase my father had used so many times, "selfish brat," and the way my mother often told me, "You always make everything about you," whenever I asked for the bare minimum of attention. When the post was ready, I scheduled it to go live at noon, a time when I knew most people in town would be on their lunch breaks scrolling through their phones. As the clock ticked toward 12, my heart pounded, but it was not fear. It was anticipation. At exactly noon, the post went up, and within minutes my phone was vibrating again. This time, the reactions were even stronger. Former family friends commented about moments they had witnessed that now made more sense. Old neighbors shared stories of my parents berating me in public when I was a kid. Some of Sarah's coworkers weighed in, expressing shock that the smiling woman they worked with could laugh while her sister was locked in a cage. The story spread beyond my circle into community groups and local news chatter. By the end of the day, I had been contacted by a small online news outlet wanting to run a piece about it. I agreed to speak on the record using my real name and providing the video and timeline. I knew that once it was published, it would follow them everywhere they went. There would be no corner of this town or beyond where they could hide behind their carefully crafted facade. The fallout began almost instantly after the timeline post went live. By late afternoon, my phone was flooded with screenshots from friends showing the posts being shared in local Facebook groups and even on the town's community bulletin page. People who had known my parents for decades were expressing shock, anger, and disbelief. The video was impossible to deny, and the years of documented neglect painted a picture that no amount of smooth talking could erase. That evening, Daniel's cousin called to tell me she had overheard two members of the church council discussing an emergency meeting about my father's position as a deacon. They were concerned about the damage to the church's reputation and the hypocrisy of a man who preached morality on Sundays while treating his own daughter this way. By the next morning, word had spread to his workplace where he served on the board of a local charity. I received a message from a former board member who told me my father had been asked to step down immediately to avoid further scandal. My mother, who volunteered at several community events, stopped showing up altogether. According to a neighbor, she had been confronted at the grocery store by someone demanding to know how she could stand by and watch her husband lock her daughter in a cage. Sarah's situation unraveled just as quickly. The law firm where she worked was tagged repeatedly in posts sharing the video, and people were leaving comments on their business page questioning why they employed someone capable of mocking her own sister during such an act. Within 2 days, Sarah's social media accounts were deleted, and a mutual acquaintance told me she had been placed on leave while the firm reviewed the situation. The speed at which their public standing collapsed was dizzying, but I felt no guilt. For years, they had been insulated by the image they projected, and now the truth had stripped it away in a matter of days. That weekend, Daniel and I went to the local farmers market, and for the first time, I noticed people looking at me with recognition. Not pity, but respect. Several strangers came up quietly to say they had seen the posts and believed I was brave for speaking out. One older woman even told me she wished she had done the same when her own family treated her badly decades ago. Meanwhile, my phone continued to light up with messages from relatives. Some expressed support, saying they had always suspected something was wrong but had never seen proof. Others accused me of destroying the family's reputation and begged me to take the posts down. I ignored the latter. There was no going back to silence. On Sunday morning, the church service included a public statement from the pastor acknowledging the situation without naming names, but emphasizing that the congregation did not condone abuse in any form. I knew it was directed at my parents, and the murmur in the pews confirmed that everyone else did too. By Monday, my father's once constant schedule of community involvement was empty. My mother stopped answering her phone. Sarah stayed at her apartment, avoiding any public appearances. The life they had built around control and appearances had crumbled, and all it had taken was the truth finally being seen. In the weeks that followed the initial storm, the dust did not settle the way I think my parents and Sarah had hoped. The story remained a point of conversation in town, lingering like a stubborn shadow over every interaction they tried to have. Even the relatives who had defended them at first began to pull away after realizing the video and documentation left no room for denial. The invitations to community events stopped arriving, their once busy calendars emptied. My father, who had always been quick to lecture others about discipline and respect, found himself unwelcome in spaces where he used to hold court. My mother's attempts to volunteer at the library and local food bank were quietly declined. As for Sarah, the law firm officially announced her departure, citing a mutual agreement to part ways, though everyone knew the real reason. She tried freelancing for a while, but her name and face had been shared so widely that potential clients often backed out. I kept my distance from all of them, not out of spite, but because I needed to protect the peace I was building. Daniel and I focused on our life with Lily, enjoying the small milestones that came with her rapid growth. Her first smile, the way she started to track us with her eyes, her tiny fingers gripping mine. I poured energy into my interior design work, taking on new clients who had found me through the posts and saw me as resilient and trustworthy. The business began to thrive in a way it never had before. My decision to speak out had not only freed me from their control, but unexpectedly opened doors professionally and personally. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all would hit me late at night when the house was quiet, and I thought about the finality of what I had done. I had effectively ended my relationship with the people who had raised me, and there was no roadmap for navigating that loss. But then I would remember the image of my father's hand shoving me into that cage, my mother turning away, and Sarah laughing, and I would know there was nothing left to salvage. Some relatives did try to repair the bridge, cautiously reaching out to say they had been wrong to ignore the signs, or to believe my parents' version of events. I appreciated those gestures, but I made it clear that reconciliation with me meant accepting the truth fully without excuses. Daniel and I eventually made the decision to move to a nearby city, giving us physical distance as well as emotional. In our new neighborhood, no one knew my parents or their history, which allowed me to breathe easier. We enrolled Lily in a daycare where the teachers greeted her warmly each morning and where I could see her growing up surrounded by genuine kindness. Months later, I heard from a former neighbor that my parents had sold their house quietly and moved out of town, likely to escape the constant reminder of what had happened. Sarah moved in with them for a while, but rumors suggested she was restless and unhappy. The irony was that in trying to cage me, they had trapped themselves in a smaller, lonelier life. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. I no longer needed their approval, and they no longer had the means to withhold it as punishment. What remained was the life Daniel, Lily, and I were building free from their toxic influence. Looking back on everything that happened, I see the dog cage for what it truly was. Not just a crude piece of metal meant to hold an animal, but a symbol of the control my family had tried to impose on me for as long as I could remember. They had always wanted to define my place, to remind me of it whenever I dared to step outside the boundaries they set. That day in my own yard, surrounded by people who should have loved me, they tried to lock me into that role physically as they had emotionally for years. But stepping out of it with Daniel's help and later showing the world exactly what they had done shattered that illusion forever. The cage no longer belongs to them. In my mind, it belongs to me as a reminder that I will never allow myself to be trapped again. Speaking out was not easy. There were moments when I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had destroyed something that could have been repaired. Yet every time doubt crept in, I would remember the silence of those empty chairs at Lily's celebration and the sound of Sarah's laugh as the lock clicked shut. Those memories reminded me that what I did was not about revenge for the sake of cruelty, but about reclaiming my dignity and ensuring my daughter grows up knowing her worth is not dictated by anyone else's approval. The public fallout forced my parents and Sarah to confront the reality they had always denied, and while it brought them consequences they could not escape, it also brought me clarity. I learned that family is not defined solely by blood, but by respect, support, and genuine care. I learned that setting boundaries is not an act of hostility, but of self-preservation, and that walking away from those who refuse to treat you with decency is not a loss, but a gain. Today, I focus on building a life with Daniel and Lily, surrounded by people who choose to show up not out of obligation, but out of love. I share my story openly because I want others to know that they are not alone, and that it is possible to break free from cycles of abuse and control. Sometimes the path to peace requires burning bridges and letting the ashes drift away, and sometimes the deepest wounds lead to the strongest foundations for the future. If you are listening to this and have ever been made to feel small by those who should have lifted you up, know this: your worth is not theirs to decide.